Okay, so this is the third video lecture. We're still on the topic of global stratification. The last one, I was talking about functionalism and conflict theory. These next three slides are really about different ways to conceptualize this ranking, the layering around the globe, so the ranking of nations. One way, so here's some ways that you may have heard of the way the world is ranked. So one of them is maybe you've heard of first world, second world, and third world. These are all concepts that come from the Cold War. I didn't know that till I read that in your textbook. The idea, so these sociologists don't use this idea, the idea of first, second, and third, because it's sort of obviously it implies that there's a ranking to the different nations, and it really doesn't tell us anything. It's just a sort of a value judgment. Then you have another way of thinking about it, and that's developed, developing, and underdeveloped. Well, the same thing, the same sort of concept here is what does that mean, developed? I mean, an indigenous person would look at the Flint Hills, say, and say that that's perfectly developed, but some capitalist real estate person would say it's undeveloped. So, whose definition of development are we going to use? So, this is what we would consider ethnocentric. And again, it doesn't really tell us anything, it's all a matter of perspective. One that's more likely to be used is what is this concept of industrialized, industrializing, and least industrialized. And the reason this is preferred to the others is because one, it's not necessarily value judgment, right? But it describes the economy or describes the way people live their life. And actually, we should probably have a couple other ones in here, like post-industrialized. That's generally what the United States would be. So that's what this map here is. This map is an attempt to sort of illustrate the nature of the industry that is predominant. Actually, I think this one might be natural resources. That might be natural resources. Probably not exactly the same thing. But the nature of the way people live their life. So in a least industrialized nation, folks are more likely to be, say, hunter-gatherers, agrarian, whereas in a most industrialized, they're probably not farming to eat their own food, right? There's probably a lot of industry. Maybe it's information industry, maybe it's factories, who knows. Here's another way of thinking about the world, and this is world systems theory. This is a really important sociological model, and the map is an attempt to sort of illustrate how these nations. The idea is that the world is basically made up of that nations are interconnected, right? And it's a world system. You have the core nations, those are the blue nations here. These are the ones, well, this is the analogy I used to like to use, is I always think of it as sort of the like high school, right? You have the popular kids and the not so popular kids and then the outcasts. But everybody knows the popular kids. If you're an outcast or a not so popular kid, you know them, but they don't necessarily know who everybody else is. And that's kind of the way the core nations are. The core nations are the ones that kind of control the whole system. And what they do is they take goods from the peripheral and the semi-peripheral nations. I want to talk about the semi-peripheral nations. These are the ones that are in yellow. These are the kind of popular kids, right? These are the not popular but not outcast kids. So the core nations are aware of the semi-peripheral nations. In this model, the core nations will buy their raw materials, they'll import their workers, right? Kind of like maybe the popular kids take advantage of the not so popular kids, right? Invite them to the party sometimes, but they don't really like control them or influence them. Then you have, I'm sorry, I'm getting confused. Then you have the marginalized kids. These are the peripheral nations. And these are the ones that, well, what does it say? These are the cheap and the raw materials and the cheap labor. So the idea is that these core nations will send their finished products to both the semi-peripheral and the peripheral nations, and these other nations they're basically exploited by the core nations, right? So they're the ones sending raw materials and cheap labor, but who really controls the system is the core nations and the whole world. And then you have some of these shifts historically. Another way of conceptualize, so if you've ever heard of the idea of a new world order, that's kind of what this is. A new world order is we would be shifting from a core nation to maybe a semi or a peripheral nation, while China becomes a core nation. Another way of thinking about the ranking of nations around the world is what we call world by income. And I tried to find, this is the closest map I could find. And so it breaks it down. This could be argued as a kind of an oversimplified way of thinking about things, but it breaks the world down into these three income groups. You have the high income nations, middle income, and low. So the high income would be the blue here, and the red are the low income nations, and everybody else is the middle. So the struggles, the things that high income nations deal with is something called capital flight and deindustrialization. So capital flight is when a factory moves overseas because they don't have to pay workers the same wages, or they don't have to deal with OSHA regulations or Environmental Protection Agency. So capital, the factory, is exporting, is moving to some other part of the world, really for profit of whoever owns the factory, whoever owns capital. Deindustrialization is a phenomena or a byproduct of that. So as these industries, I learned this the other day, I'm taking a welding class. In my welding class, that once upon a time, I did know this, once upon a time, the United States was one of the major manufacturers of steel. Now, the top 10, like US isn't even in the top 20 countries of the steel industry. We're not producing steel. Now, in the top 10, 9 of the top steel manufacturers are in China, and the 10th one is in India. This is an illustration of deindustrialization. The industry, the steel industry, no longer exists in the US. Same thing with like cars, tires. All of this is an example of capital flight. They're moving to another part of the world. Middle income nations, their problem, and we'll talk more about this in another couple video lectures too, is a problem of neocolonialism and debt accumulation. Both of those are kind of the same thing, or debt accumulation as a byproduct of neocolonialism. Colonialism, neo means new. But to be a colony means your natural resources are being extracted and used by another nation. So we were once a colony. We were once a colony to England, right? Raw materials, cotton and molasses. It wasn't molasses. Cotton and tobacco were all being shipped to England. They were being made into some sort of product and then sold back to us. That's supposedly why we went to a civil war. That is an example of a colony. A new kind of colonialization is where a wealthy nation exports your raw materials or your people or your money, because when these wealthy nations loan money to other nations, when they accumulate debt, it's, if any of you have a credit card and you know what happens when you make the minimum payment on your credit card, how you never ever pay it off. Well, think of it. If Mexico borrows money from us and we charge interest on that debt, and all Mexico can do is to pay the interest. Mexico is in. Same way with you and I. We're not building up our savings account when we're paying off our credit card debt. So in this way, the credit card company keeps us constantly in debt to them, and in this way, it's like these core nations, these high income nations, loan money to the poor nations that they can never pay off. And so they're constantly remaining in debt and therefore obligated to do what the wealthy high income nations ask them to do. And then finally, you have the low income nations. See how these are kind of similar, right? When you talk about world systems theory, you have a similar model. Probably you could overlap the maps. But you have the low income nations, which interestingly enough, if you were to take the global population, the majority of the globe's population live in places that would be considered the low income nations. So when you start talking about, and then you can get into the whole notion about space and people and natural resources, right? When we have fewer people in these highly industrialized nations like the United States, and if you were to divide up all the space per person, there is more space per person in a highly industrialized nation than there is space per person in an agrarian nation, such as like Africa or Brazil. But in an industrialized nation, I don't need the land. I don't need the ability to engage in agricultural production in order to live. But in an agricultural nation where there are more people and less space per person, they actually need that land in order to survive. So another sort of way of thinking about inequity. I'm going to stop here, and when I come back, I want to talk about global poverty.